This video here will introduce very briefly social identity theory and kind of the context around it. So it's portions of chapter 13, but not all of chapter 13, as we will use some of that in class as well. It's good to come to class, I think, with an idea of what we'll be learning about, but there are quite a few things that can be helpful for us to discuss in person, in a large group, and small groups as well. So we will do some of this online and then some of this in class. So the interesting thing for me about social identity theory is we just previously in Module 3 learned about identity theory. So who am I? We also learned about interpersonal, so my relationships with others. And when we talk about identity theory, this came up a few times um, in Module 3, but we often talk about identity theory from the perspective of roles that we play in the world. So I am a mother, I am a student, I am a XYZ. So you put yourself in context of like, I am an athlete. It's kind of these not tangible, but clear roles, clear relationships that we play within a certain dynamic. We also talk about salience, which I will touch on in one of the slides coming up here. And that's really how important something is to yourself, and we will touch on that as well. So it might be incredibly important for me to be a mom, and maybe student takes a backseat to that. Vice versa, I went to college and I was not a mom, so student took precedence and daughter took second to student in that particular case. We'll just get that as an example. Module 4 actually is going to ask us about social identity theory. So instead of us considering who I am individually, I'm actually going to be considering to what group I belong. So if we think about some of the different social identities, the book will cover them. We'll talk about them in our discussion board. But if I think about a social identity as being able-bodied versus a person with a disability, the group that I personally would have belonged to in that would be the able-bodied group. And so you can see there that there's two different social identity groups, and I belong to one of them. Likewise, if I think about myself from an educational perspective, I am not a first-generation college student. My parents received a college education, so I would belong to the group that had parents with educations. So now I belong to able-bodied group and parents with education, but that creates 4 different groups if we think about that as kind of a matrix. And it continues to become more complicated as you layer on additional social identities. So really here, we're going to be thinking about social categories or groups that we belong to, which is a different way to think about our identities. So now that I kind of have a better idea of who I am, I'm going to start thinking about what that means in terms of the social contexts with which I interact. One of the themes that we will talk about, one of the words that comes up over and over and over again when you think about social identity theory, is the idea of how salient an identity is to you, or the concept, again, of salience. So Merriam-Webster, just so we're all on the same page at the start of this module, talks about salience as something standing out conspicuously, how prominent something is, something that's especially of notable significance. So for me, when I went to my master's program, one of my identities that was incredibly salient at the time was that I had just finished up my final season as a student athlete, and I found myself coming back over and over and over again to this athlete identity that I had. Some of my other classmates didn't have that same salient identity. They came back over and over again to something completely different. And so it will be interesting for us as we're going through this to consider what is most salient to you and perhaps how that's changed over time or in different contexts. So again, down here, each of our identities are more or less salient to our overall identity. So if you think about our social identities as we each have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 identities, social identities, each will be more or less salient. And this will actually pop up again in the article that we read next week and is covered also in a portion of chapter 13 with a nice diagram that we will cover in class. So again, we've got this idea of social identity, to what group do I belong, and then how salient that group is maybe compared to those other groups that I belong to. The last thing that I think would be helpful for us to be mindful of as we come to class is thinking about why social identity theories and why studying this is important. And the book, once again, gives us a short but concise historical overview of some of the different historical moments in which social groups move forward or pushed their rights forward, or we became more aware of the needs of particular groups. So the book starts in the 1960s in the United States and gives us the context of civil rights being incredibly important, and that being a social identity group that the United States started to become more aware of. Likewise, in the 1970s, the gay rights movement really moved forward. So those are two different social identities that we need to consider with our students within society. Interestingly, then in the 1980s, they came up with a few different individual cultural group theories, so slightly different from civil rights specifically or gay rights specifically. And each of those, the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, were really focused on specific types of social identities. In the 1990s, then people started to consider the concept of multiple identities. So, what if I identified as Black and gay, right? So, two marginalized social identity groups, and what would that mean for a particular person? So, beginning to consider the complexity of layering different social identities on top of one another and how that affects the experience of that particular person, and really trying to wrap our minds around the fact that we are not just one identity, we are multiple identities. Starting really in the early 2000s until now, and I would imagine just beyond, there has been a large increase in research on identity development, specifically multiple identities, how they intersect with one another, um, and all of the different social identity groups in different contexts. So you might look at students that identify as gay or lesbian in their transition to college, maybe at a large public school, maybe at a large public school in a more conservative area, maybe at a large public school in a more liberal area. So there's been a lot of research coming forward on identity development. And this makes sense if we think about historically how we as a nation and we as a globe really are becoming more global. We're seeing more movement between people, more movement and communication across culture, across race, across religion. And that's really pushed us forward in terms of our consideration of social identities and how they interact. So having a little bit of history, while this isn't perfect and it's not a lot, it gives us some context as to how we got to where we are today. It will also give you some context as we read 14 through 18, because it will be important to, again, recall the years in which these theories were being developed. So we will cover this more in class on Tuesday, but that is just a snippet of social identity and where we are heading.